any time. Without objections, members of the full committee, not on the subcommittee, are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing is entitled Housing America, Addressing Challenges in Serving People Experiencing Homelessness. I now recognize myself for 3 minutes. Homelessness in the United States is an unnecessary and worsening crisis. According to HUD, between 2016 and 2020, homelessness increased in the richest nation on the planet by 6%, with more than 580,000 people, including children, experiencing homelessness in January of 2020. The significant economic instability brought by COVID-19 and reports of crisis from homeless service providers on the front lines have only heightened concerns about conditions facing homeless and at-risk populations. In every congressional district in the country, homeless service providers have worked tirelessly to benefit those communities. It is without question that these service providers are heroes and that the work they provide do save American lives. It is also without question that service providers have been asked to solve complex systemic problems with woefully insufficient resources and a unique set of professional challenges. It is my intent that this hearing will allow the public to better understand the challenges that local homeless service providers face in the battle to end homelessness in our country, and that members of this subcommittee will better be able to continue to explore ways that we can provide the needed support and resources to the benefit of those who are in need. I would also be remiss not to emphasize that while the causes of homelessness are many, the affordable housing crisis is an accelerant to open flames. Soaring housing costs and growing backlogs for critical housing resources have pushed some Americans into homelessness and left millions more at risk. In addition, the national strain on housing resources limits the ability of service providers to provide positive outcomes for Americans battling housing insecurity. In the United States, 40% of people experiencing homelessness are currently employed, yet unable to obtain stable housing. The Build Back Better Act passed by the House in November includes very, 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 very important provisions for the committee, for which we would now like to pass in the Senate. I've heard opponents of these investments in the House. Many of their arguments, I think, are rather weak, but we will get into this hopefully as this committee hearing proceeds. I would like now to recognize the ranking member of our committee, Mr. Hill from Arkansas, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening the hearing to talk about an issue that's important to all of us in our local districts with all of our constituents, and that's the issues and how we best locally and nationally address homelessness. I'd like to start by talking about the success we've had in my district. First, with my own team. I'm so grateful to our combat wounded warriors. We have 3 on our staff, and how they've worked seamlessly with our veteran community to tackle veteran homelessness and help those veterans find shelter. And it's one of the most rewarding parts of my job and my time in Congress. Second, I would say that Central Arkansas is blessed by having a robust and well-coordinated support system to help our brothers and sisters that are homeless, including many of our great nonprofits like the Salvation Army, Jericho Way, Union Rescue Mission, St. Francis House, which has a particular emphasis on veterans, the Veteran Villages of America, run by a great Iraq veteran, Colonel Mike Ross, Goodwill, and then Our House. All of them work together seamlessly to try to eliminate homelessness and fight for shelter in the skills. From Little Rock to Los Angeles, people experiencing housing insecurity need not just a safe place to stay, but also supportive services, whether it's clinical help, career coaching, or case management. That way people can not only get housed, but eventually get their own place, break the cycle of homelessness, and begin their pursuit of happiness. That's why organizations like Our House in successfully working in Little Rock, as well as the Doe Fund in New York that we'll hear from today, have an expanding array of supportive services, including job training, childcare, and others that are successful in going well beyond shelter. I look forward to discussing how the Housing First approach disadvantages many successful local service providers, like those in my district, from receiving appropriate federal funding, and why we should support those that provide crucial wraparound services, as well as a true holistic approach to reducing homelessness. Before I yield the balance of my time, I just want to share a story or two from Arkansans that have found success in these sorts of programs. Joshua is a constituent of mine in Little Rock. He had trouble finding stable housing after he left prison. He came to Our House and has been around working there since 1987. He quickly settled in, found a home in the shelter, and joined a job training program on campus. And now, since last year, Joshua has worked in the guard shack, where he enjoys meeting people as they come to seek help. Because of his hard work and dedication, Joshua was selected to move into Our House's transitional housing, where he's been attending classes to earn his forklift certification and eventually lead to that career. Joshua, we're proud of you, and we're with you every step of the way. Joshua's story is so important, and it illustrates the importance of not just providing a safe place to stay, but giving people the resources and the help they need to succeed. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to our discussion today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from the Snowfield, Iowa area of our country. Ms. Axner, you're recognized now for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. It's really good that we're having this hearing. I appreciate you holding this, because at last count, we had over 580,000 Americans who were experiencing homelessness, and over 2,500 right here in Iowa. Tonight, the wind chill in Iowa will be -15 degrees. That's dangerous for anyone, let alone those who are forced to sleep outside tonight because they couldn't find shelter. I hope we get as many people sheltered in the short term as possible, but we absolutely need to use this hearing to discuss more solutions to address homelessness for the long term, including my bill to give rural areas more flexibility to help people experiencing homelessness. We need to implement the ideas we discussed today to get us back on track to finding people the homes they need, like we were a few years ago. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters.
Thank you so very much for this subcommittee hearing that you're doing. And I'm here today to listen to our witnesses. I am absolutely upset and I'm unhappy about the lack of progress that some of our cities are making, despite the fact that we're doing everything that we can to get the resources to them. And I spent 6 hours out on the street working with the homeless who were in tents with all the trash, etc., and was able to offer them Project Home Key, despite the fact that we were having locals telling us people didn't want to get off the street. Every one of them accepted getting into hotel rooms for the night and being able to work with whomever in order to transition them to permanent housing. And so I want to hear what these obstacles are, because I am not pleased at all. And we've got to move the homeless off the street. And I think we can all do a better job. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, we welcome the testimony of 4 distinguished witnesses. First, we have Ms. Adriana Bush, who is the Executive Director of the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky. Next, we have Mix Doanes, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. Then we have Ms. Oliva, who is the Vice President for housing policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priority. Next, we have Ms. Nan Roman, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Last, I will recognize Mr. Hill to introduce our final witness.
Would you like me to do that now, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
Well, I appreciate that. I've got the pleasure of introducing Miss Harriet McDonald today, who serves as president of the Doe Fund in New York City. Harriet is a longtime and fierce advocate for people experiencing homelessness at the Doe Fund, which she co-founded with her husband, the late George McDonald. And first, Harriet, on behalf of all of us, let me offer condolences to the Ready, Willing, and Able and Doe Fund teams and family over the loss of George. You and George have truly been points of light in New York, helping the less fortunate. And Manhattan and New York is a much better place because of you. I've been fortunate to visit the Doe Fund several times since I've been in Congress. And every time I return, I'm so impressed by the work done by the men and women of Ready, Willing, and Able to fight homelessness and hopelessness due to this enormous challenge. The Doe Fund is an extraordinary success, not only because it's lowered criminal recidivism and has higher work attachment than virtually any other program for homeless in New York City, but because it specializes in tackling the hardest cases and helping the most in need. That's what impresses me so much about this organization. I thank Harriet McDonald for taking her time to lend her expertise, and I look forward to her testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hill, and welcome, Ms. McDonald, for sharing time with us this morning. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be also able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony when your time has expired so that we can be respectful of both witnesses and committee members' time. Without objection, your written statements will be made a part of our record. Ms. Bush, let me recognize you for being with us today. And we will begin with, apologize. We're going to begin with Ms. Adriana Bush, who is Executive Director of Homeless and Housing Coalition in Kentucky. And we will move down the witness line. I will introduce them as they speak. So I will begin with Ms. Roman. Pardon me. Ms. Roman, I'll begin with you. Hold on with me. Well, we won't begin with Ms. We'll begin with Ms. Bush. Our nation is in the midst of a rental crisis that most severely affects America's lowest income families. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, there are fewer than 4 affordable and available rental houses in our country right now. And so I have her. Okay. All right, I'm getting clarifications. We will just recognize Ms. Bush, and we will proceed on to thank and give 5 minutes to Mr. Mixed Marshal Marc Doanes, Chief Executive Officer of Kings County Regional Homelessness. Mr. Doanes.
I apologize, Mr. Chair. Is Ms. Bush speaking before me, or?
No, you're now. You're on now.
I'm on now. Okay, thank you.
The curtain is pulled back. The nation is watching and waiting. You're on right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the rest of the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Marc Doanes, and I have the honor of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. The authority is charged with the oversight of the entirety of the homelessness system in King County, inclusive of the city of Seattle and other 38 cities and our unincorporated areas. We are currently facing a growing crisis of national proportions, aided and abetted by policy choices that have misunderstood the root causes of homelessness and under-resourced the solutions that are most effective. Our investments in the homelessness space have been over-focused on services that offer subclinical support while leaving systems unable to provide the actual housing solutions that people need. As the system administrator for the third largest continuum of care, I'm here to tell you that it simply doesn't matter how many social workers attend to a person's needs, how many outreach workers are available to connect with our unsheltered neighbors, if we don't have anywhere for them to go. And that is precisely where we stand today. The reality is that there is no number of social workers who will ever transform into a house. Until we prioritize stabilizing the housing market for lower income individuals, we will not end homelessness, we will simply manage it. We must also recognize that homelessness is incontrovertibly a racial justice issue. Homelessness disproportionately impacts people of color as a direct result of this country's history of racialized exclusion from housing. While Black people represent only 12% of the general population, we routinely make up 30 to 40% or more of the homeless population. Native people, who make up only 1% of the general population, often make up 3 to 6% of the population experiencing homelessness. We must not forget that it wasn't until 1968, with the passage of the Fair Housing Act, that this country stepped towards ensuring people of color had access to the same housing finance tools as white Americans. This legacy is alive today in the patterns of generational wealth that communities can access to get through hard times, like housing bubble bursts, global recessions, or global pandemics. Our national strategy to end homelessness must be aligned with these fundamentals and focus on ending the racialized outcomes that continue to harm people even as we sit here today. Put quite frankly, the time has come for America to decide whether it will live down to its racist history or up to the dreams we all hold for it. And the decision to solve homelessness is a core component of that. This will require us to understand that homelessness is an economic issue. It's about not having the money to pay rent. At the local level, we see over and over again that many of the people in our shelter system, or frankly in our encampments, are working. What they aren't is making a living wage. We also know that the belief that homelessness is driven by behavioral health is false. What we tend to see is that even if people present with these concerns, they frequently begin after the experience of homelessness, not before. The reality is that every day we allow someone to experience homelessness, the harder it will be for us to connect them with the resources they need. Because of this, we must transform our homelessness systems into true crisis response, as has been called for since the first USICH plan in 2010. In order to do that, we must equip systems with the necessary resources to act quickly and decisively when people experience homelessness. Jurisdictions have had success acquiring hotels, motels, and stalled market rate projects to repurpose as housing supports. To some degree, this is a reinvestment in the SRO and other low-income housing stock that was wiped from the American landscape during the suburbanization of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. This low-income housing stock has played a significant role, or the lack thereof, rather, in the inability to exit people from homelessness without some form of subsidy and the rise of the modern formation of homelessness itself. Additionally, given the fragile economic networks that communities face, we must continue to invest in diversion and other cash benefits that are tried and proven methods of keeping people from entering homelessness and prevent further public investment farther down the road. This data-driven decision-making is critical for the appropriate targeting of resources, which absolutely must include prioritization of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. It is unacceptable for our policies to force people to live outside, and we must make a concerted effort to end unsheltered homelessness in America. Finally, we must invest in our workforce. For 30 years, our field has been chronically underfunded, and as a result, we've seen our pipeline collapse. Providers are hemorrhaging staff who are no longer willing to tolerate poverty wages while trying to end homelessness. The fact of the matter is, this work is done by people helping other people. There is no app that is going to change that. Housing case managers, recovery coaches, peer navigators, these are all fancy terms for people who have decided that the thing they want to do with their lives is help others. And we as a country need to decide, do we care about our caretakers? I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Ms. Bush. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and members. I am honored to share our thoughts on ending homelessness in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. My name is Adriana Bush, and I'm the Executive Director of the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky, a statewide nonpartisan advocacy organization with a unique perspective on administering housing assistance to people experiencing homelessness. Our mission is to eliminate the threat of homelessness and fulfill the promise of affordable housing. To that end, we also step in to identify gaps to provide continuum of care and emergency solutions grant assistance when requested. Additionally, we convene and staff the Kentucky Interagency Council on Homelessness, the statewide homeless policy and planning body authorized by state statute. We are a state partner of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and we abide by the principles that A, housing is a human right, and B, housing ends homelessness. Here is what we know about homelessness in our small, mostly rural state. Using multiple sources, including the point-in-time count, the coordinated entry process, and hospital discharge data, we know that just over 4,000 people enter street or shelter homelessness annually. Further, we know that Kentucky is not immune to systemic racial disparities among people entering homelessness. Most glaringly, 25% of people experiencing homelessness are Black in a state where only 8% of the general population identifies as Black. And the odds ratio of a Black hospital patient being identified as experiencing homelessness was 70% higher than the odds for a white patient. In Kentucky, there are 3 continuum of care jurisdictions: Lexington, Fayette County, Louisville, Jefferson County, and then the 118 counties outside of our 2 largest cities comprise the balance of state. Each COC maximizes federal funding to the extent possible. While Lexington and Louisville often are able to offer additional local revenue to support homeless assistance activities, homeless service providers in the balance of state rarely have that option and use much smaller allocations of COC and ESG funds. Each COC prioritizes projects that implement housing first principles and strategy. They offer housing with case management and connection to employment and other services tailored to the needs of the household and the community. Barriers to ending homelessness and housing insecurity writ large are driven by the lack of affordable housing. As the members of this subcommittee are well aware, the housing crisis is prevalent nationwide. And in Kentucky, where our cost of living is theoretically lower than the coast, prior to the pandemic, we were short nearly 78,000 affordable and available rental homes for extremely low-income Kentuckians. The average wage renters earn in Kentucky is $14.25 per hour, while the hourly wage required to pay for a 2-bedroom rental home is $15.78. Service and care sector jobs, where many labor shortages are occurring, have a median hourly wage of $9 to $10 per hour here in Kentucky. It's also important to recognize that not all job openings with living wages are spread equitably across regions within a state. And this is acutely true in areas of long-standing depressed economies such as Appalachian Kentucky. Congress, through the leadership of the House Financial Services Committee, has taken bold steps to reduce homelessness through the housing provisions in the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act. Now is the time to continue that work through passage of the Build Back Better Act and other legislation for consideration today. At HHCK, we know what works in Kentucky communities, whether in larger cities like Louisville to our small rural towns. Given the challenges the United States faces in coming out of the pandemic, now is the time to correct course away from the affordable housing crisis and provide the foundation to end homelessness through legislation and correctly scaled funding. Thank you for your consideration of my remarks this morning, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bush, for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Oliva. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, Chairman Cleaver, and Ranking Member Hill. My name is Ann Oliva, and I'm the Vice President for Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I want to commend this subcommittee for the housing-related relief measures enacted during the pandemic. Thank you as well to Chairwoman Waters, Chairman Cleaver, and Representative Torres for your continued leadership on homelessness, including the introduction of the Ending Homelessness Act of 2021, which, if enacted, would address many of the challenges that we're discussing today. The housing investments made as part of the nation's pandemic response are helping communities to keep families in their housing and are providing critical resources for those experiencing homelessness in significant ways. More than 3.2 million households, most of whom have very low or extremely low incomes, have received emergency rental assistance. Communities have issued nearly 23,000 emergency housing vouchers to households experiencing or at risk of homelessness, and more than 9,500 units have been leased. Emergency Solutions Grants funding has helped communities respond to the needs of people living unsheltered and in shelters, and home funds will help communities build permanent and supportive housing. These resources are the right start, but more investments are needed to address capacity and equity challenges being experienced on the ground. All the reliable evidence tells us that the situation for people experiencing homelessness is urgent, and that the homelessness crisis, which predates the pandemic, will persist afterwards without serious intervention. The Census Pulse survey continues to show that millions of households are at risk of eviction and that people of color continue to be disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. In 2020, for the first time since we started gathering this data, we saw an increase in the number of people in families with kids living unsheltered, and the number of individuals living on the streets exceeded the number of individuals living in shelters also for the first time. HUD reports that more than 580,000 people experienced homelessness on a single night in January of 2020, and that nearly 1.5 million people experienced sheltered homelessness at some time in 2018. People of color are disproportionately impacted by homelessness. Families experiencing homelessness are typically headed by women, many are headed by young parents, and they include a high percentage of young children. Youth, veterans, and adults experiencing chronic homelessness are suffering on our streets and in our shelters every day. And data shows that more than half of sheltered people and 40% of unsheltered people experiencing homelessness work, but still can't afford housing. Homelessness assistance systems face daunting challenges. Some are longstanding issues like the scarcity of available supportive and affordable housing units, but new challenges have also emerged. Rising rents make finding and keeping permanent housing more difficult for extremely low-income people. The urgency created by the pandemic has stretched community planning and staffing resources thin, creating unanticipated implementation challenges. Congregate shelters have proven to be unsafe environments for people who often have underlying health issues. Criminalization of people experiencing homelessness is rising, and more resources are needed. Communities consistently report that they want and need more housing and service resources. Expanding the Housing Choice Voucher Program and building new units through well-targeted programs is the most important and effective step Congress can take to address this crisis. Congress should pass a Build Back Better Act that retains critical housing investments, which currently includes voucher expansion that we estimate would serve about 300,000 extremely low-income households after phase-in, including about 80,000 households experiencing or at risk of homelessness, an estimated 70% of whom are people of color. I regularly partner with people who have experienced homelessness, and their priorities are clear. 1, create more affordable housing options and supports, and target those most impacted by structural inequity. 2, develop and support dignity-based services led by the communities most impacted by homelessness. 3, reimagine congregate shelter and crisis response options. And 4, end practices and policies that criminalize people experiencing homelessness. The need for housing assistance is urgent, especially for historically marginalized people. Now is the time for bold action to increase housing supply and affordability nationwide, to partner with people with lived expertise to define solutions, and to set communities up for success by making services more accessible. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Ms. Oliva. We appreciate your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Roman. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and Chairwoman Waters, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify before you today. I'm Nan Roman, CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit education, policy, and capacity building organization. Briefly, a few comments on where we stand on homelessness. As other witnesses have said, homelessness has been going up slightly every year since 2016. Due to the pandemic, we're not certain where the numbers stand today. The Alliance has conducted 4 surveys of the nation's continuums of care during the pandemic, and most COCs feel that the number of homeless people is up, including unsheltered numbers being up. It is our belief that unsheltered homelessness is likely increased, and it's possible that overall homelessness is also increased. And as others have said, people of color are disproportionately homeless, and there are disparities in the availability and the impact of the assistance they receive from the homeless assistance system. So this is where we stand on homelessness today. Thanks to your work, there is a significant opportunity at the moment to make a serious dent in the problem of homelessness. The inability of people to afford housing is the major driver of homelessness and the major solution to homelessness. That's not to say that people don't need services and jobs. They do need services and jobs, but everything works better when people have safe, stable, and affordable housing. I think we could all say that about our own lives. During the past 2 years, you have generously provided through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act the very resources that people experiencing homelessness need to return to housing. And Build Back Better, should it advance, fingers crossed, will build upon those resources. These resources are not going to be enough to end homelessness, but they can certainly reverse its course, and they represent a significant opportunity for us to make a difference. Of course, there are many challenges as well to making progress. A key challenge is to apply the resources that you have provided in the most strategic ways possible. Organizations, agencies, and their staffs are depleted and they're struggling. It's easier to house people who have lower needs, who do not require services, who are more acceptable to landlords, or who are not yet homeless than it is to house people who are literally homeless, possibly unsheltered, and have high service needs. But to reduce homelessness, we really need to focus on the latter group, not the former group. A critical priority is to address the needs of unsheltered people. It's just not acceptable that in a nation with the resources and capacity of ours, 230,000 people should be sleeping on the streets every night. Data indicate that people who are unsheltered have much more serious health problems and shorter life expectancies than those living in shelter. This group should be a top priority for us, and I'm not sure that it is. Another challenge is staff shortages. Most COCs report significant shortages in staff across the board. While the sector welcomes and appreciates new resources and initiatives, it can be a struggle to implement, to follow up on those resources without staff. Similarly, new funding and initiatives often require the creation of new partnerships, important but hard work that many simply feel too overwhelmed to undertake at the moment. One final challenge is the possibility that there will be a significant post-pandemic increase in homelessness. Many federal supports will be coming to an end, and the nation is facing a period of high inflation, including for housing. While I hope that the strategic use of stimulus resources prevents it, we should be prepared for a wave of increased homelessness, possibly in the summer or next fall. Given these opportunities and challenges, there are some key solutions that the Alliance encourages communities to invest in to reduce homelessness. We recommend that they use funds to help people with the highest needs, including people who are unsheltered, those experiencing chronic homelessness, people with disabilities, families with children and pregnant women, and older adults who are homeless. On the other hand, we recommend that the funds not be used for the prevention of homelessness. There are other resources available for that. We recommend that communities allocate their resources to strategies that are specifically designed to reduce racial disparities and eliminate racial disproportionality. It is important to focus our resources on proven solutions such as housing first. Housing first is not housing only. We recommend that jurisdictions take the opportunity to investigate the possibility of converting available office and commercial space to housing. And we recommend investing in those partnerships that are needed. In closing, while people experiencing homelessness have suffered tremendously, the resources you have provided have ended homelessness. And we, for that, are.
Thank you, Ms. Roman, for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. McDonald. You are now recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. McDonald, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Now you can hear me. I want to thank you all for this really wonderful opportunity to testify about my 30 years of experience working mostly on the ground in this area. I'm the president of the Doe Fund, and I've asked that we keep the concept of opportunity at the forefront of our mind. Opportunity that leads to true self-sufficiency. It is unquestionable that the vast majority of the people that we've served are minority people. And that is, for very obvious reasons, the lack of opportunity at every level for minority people. The Doe Fund pioneered the Work Works in New York City 30 years ago. It was a similar moment of urgency. Homeless people were living on pretty much every street corner, subway grades. And one of the major areas where you could see this horrible human drama play out was Grand Central Terminal, where the thousands, literally, of people living there were desperate to survive. My deceased husband and I made it our business to spend an enormous amount of time in Grand Central with homeless people. And what we learned from them is what they told us over and over again. What they wanted was a room and a job to pay for it. We heard it constantly, a room and a job to pay for it. And that's what we set about doing. We started with 70 men that we literally picked up off the street. Off the floor of Grand Central. And we decided that we would create a work program that at that time was a total innovation in the area of homelessness. Work came first. Even before we had a contract for transitional housing, we got a contract for work. And at that time, everyone thought that homeless people were too lazy or crazy to work. From the beginning, those 70 men demonstrated the absolute opposite was true. They worked so hard. Then we got our transitional housing, and what we realized was that we needed a three-legged stool approach to ending homelessness. We have very extensive social services, including drug treatment. We have paying work, of course, very good at transitional housing, and training for jobs and an introduction to work. We clean 150 miles of New York streets every day. We also have a oil business to get oil that gets refined. We have a direct mail business. And even increasingly, in this period of the pandemic, we've grown our culinary arts program and served other hungry people in the communities in which we work. The population that we serve today is honestly no different than the population we saw then. They're demographically absolutely consistent. I believe that these single adult men make up the largest segment of the homeless population. That is who our program serves. We serve about 1,000 people at a time in Ready, Willing, and Able, and it's been replicated in 6 cities across America, whether they're rural communities, other large cities, or more suburban areas.
Thank you so much.
Oh, is that my 5? Okay.
Yes, yes.
There's just, can I add one little thing? What I'm asking for here today, I know the critical need for independent, permanent housing, but so many people can be independent. I ask you to consider funding additional models. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to, for all of the witnesses, I want to say to all of you, not far from my office here in Kansas City, Missouri, a young person, 28-year-old woman, was burned to death in a homeless encampment under I-70, a bridge at I-70, not too far from where I am right now. The fire was so bad that traffic was blocked on the freeway. Now the fire was under the freeway, but traffic was blocked on I-70. Anywhere you go in any major city, you're going to find that scene. In Washington, D.C., not far from where I live, there's an encampment of homeless individuals. And, some people are living out of the vehicles, all kinds of issues are there. One of the things that I think we have to do, and maybe Doanes, you can help here. Because I grew up in public housing, I've heard all the things. If you live in public housing, it's because you don't want to work, you want to, you all heard it, or either maybe know people who say it even today. How do we, are there things that we can be doing that maybe this committee could do, or those of us who are thinking about this issue seriously can do to try to erase all of the stigma attached to homelessness? They want to be homeless. They don't want to have food or whatever. Give us any kind of direction that you might be able to provide, Mr. Doanes. Mr. Doanes.
My experience, and it's long now, is that people desperately want to be independent. They want to be fathers to their children. They want to be contributing members of society. I get calls from guys saying, "Oh, Miss Harriet, I just paid my first taxes. I'm so excited." Because people want the dignity of being in the mainstream. So I think we also do permanent supported housing. We have now 14 buildings. And I'm not saying that's not critical for people with any kind of disability. But 95% of the people that come to us have very serious drug problems. And we deal with that on site, always have. We honestly drug test. And if people are dirty for drugs, we don't ask them to leave, but we ask them to give up the paid work. We can't put them on the street to clean the streets of Manhattan. Yes.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's very helpful. McDonald, do you have a response? You, any other panelists, to what can we do to begin to erase the stigma that also fights against us successfully getting more money that I think all of you are talking about?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So my response to that would be that the best thing we can do is incorporate people who are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness into the work that we do, right? I myself have experienced housing instability. I have a serious psychiatric condition. I've been hospitalized twice. These are not things that you would know about me unless I talk about them, right? And in being honest about that history and how I got here and how that influences my work, I think that is the most stigma disrupting thing that we can do. I mean, you yourself just spoke to growing up in public housing. I think we have to talk about it more, frankly, those of us who have made it out. I also think that, like, folks who are currently experiencing homelessness do have critical voices and real insight into what is necessary, and they are often highly refined, like thinking, right? Like I have been quoted regulation chapter and verse by people experiencing homelessness saying, these are the things that are in my way right now to getting where I want to be. And so the more that we pull those voices to the center, the more that we can disrupt the belief that is out there that folks want to live outside, that they don't actually know what's best for them or how to get where they need to go.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your testimony. It's very, very critically important. My father turned 100 on July 17th. I saw him cry about 30 years ago when he was told, he was looking at the news and told where they talked about how people didn't want to work who lived in public housing. Mr. Hill, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Every January, traditionally, HUD releases its annual homelessness assessment report to Congress, which provides estimates on the local rates of homelessness in America. Despite the federal reliance on housing first as the sole approach to ending homelessness, that rate has increased over the past several years. While I hope we would have that data before this hearing, I look forward to that report soon, and I hope, Mr. Cleaver, that we can bring attention to it at a future hearing. In my opening statement, I mentioned the story of Joshua and the success he found at our house, which is our shelter in Little Rock for the working homeless. That's been in place since 1987 and has been such a success in part of our strategy to reduce homelessness in my hometown. Adults, residents in our house are required to work full-time and save 75% of their earnings as we try to get them that important savings account, that deposit for that next apartment or that down payment for a future home. But there are specific challenges facing homeless families with children. They often get left out of many, many federal policy conversations, and the focus on housing first often leaves out nearly all families with children who are experiencing homelessness. Our house's work shows that homelessness among families with children can be solved, but it takes this kind of holistic approach. And I'm glad that they've put together a huge nonprofit that works in that way, that brings in city, private philanthropy, and some federal grant resources to achieve that. Harriet McDonald, again, thank you for coming today. It's so good to see you. And again, I'm so sad about the loss of George, but so gratified by your continued work and your passion and personality that you showed to the committee today. And so let me think through the Doe Fund as you try to access federal funding, and tell me the concerns you have when you combine paid work with transitional housing and support services. Is that make it harder to get federal grant funding?
Absolutely. Up until 2016, we won many awards from HUD because of our very strong data outcomes Harvard studied us. New York State studied us and found we reduced recidivism by 62%. HUD stopped funding us because they decided the only thing that they would really fund was permanent housing. We have 14 buildings now of really beautiful supported housing. The only people who qualified have very distinct illnesses, whether it's mental health, AIDS, being elderly and not obviously being at a point in their life where they're going to enter the workforce. And it is an essential part of the solution for people with disabilities. However, the majority of people on the street don't suffer from that.
And Harriet, tell us when you throw some numbers there. I mean,
Yes.
words, the vast majority of your clients are what we consider transitionally homeless. They're coming
Yes.
from incarceration, they're out of work, they're out of luck, they have a drug and alcohol dependency, but if
Yes.
clean, they'd be able to re-enter society fully. Is that right?
And they do.
Yeah.
We reduced recidivism by 62%, one of the highest numbers in the country. And we've now served 29,000 people in these past 30 years who have entered the mainstream, pay child support. It's actually a requirement at the Doe Fund because the mothers are incredibly poor too. And the men overwhelmingly want to be involved with their children. When you don't have a big legacy, personally, because of your hardship, your children are maybe even more important.
Well, thank you, Harriet McDonald, for your work in New York, and society there is better. And I yield back to my friend, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. The chair will now yield to the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. Waters of California.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and raise a few questions and go quickly, maybe from each of our witnesses. And I don't mean to be abrupt, but I'm now into trying to understand systems and how they work in various areas. For example, I want to know from each of you, who is responsible for your homelessness programs? Is it a department of the city council, or is it another agency that has been organized by the city council to do homelessness? And let me start with Ms. Bush.
In Kentucky, we have 3 COCs, and the balance of state is led by the State Housing Finance Agency as the collaborative applicant, Kentucky Housing Corporation. In Louisville, it is the collaborative applicant is a nonprofit organization, the Coalition for the Homeless. And then in Lexington, the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention within the city of Lexington coordinates their COC applicator, their COC activities.
Thank you. And Ms. Olivia.
Thank you for that question, Chairwoman Waters. Obviously, I don't run a continuum of care at this point in my career. I worked in the District of Columbia's continuum of care, where a nonprofit organization was identified as the collaborative applicant. But what I would say is probably the most important piece of COC work is that public and private sector partners and nonprofit organizations are working together to achieve a common goal and to ensure that people with lived expertise are helping to make those decisions.
Excuse me, where does it stop? Who has the responsibility for making sure that the funds that we receive are utilized in the way that they were intended to? Where does the buck stop?
The buck stops in many communities with the collaborative applicant, which is sometimes a nonprofit and sometimes a government entity.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Marc Doanes, what about you? Who has the responsibility? Is it the city council or a nonprofit or a combination of agencies?
Thank you, Chairwoman. The buck stops in our community with me. So I run an agency that was created through legislation that combined the efforts of the county and the city of Seattle into a single organization that has span of policy control and funding for everything in the county. And I would add that we are one of only, I believe, 3 organizations similarly situated in the country. And it really does make a big difference. The complexity of the answers you are getting, Chairwoman, is actually why it is so difficult to implement things appropriately. It should be possible for people to say to you, it is my job.
Thank you, Ms. Roman. Who runs it?
Well, I'm in the District of Columbia, so same answer. The COC is run by a nonprofit.
And so how many people know or have seen a database of the city-owned property that's available that could be used for the development of affordable housing? How many people have seen that database? Raise your hand if you've seen it. How many people believe that perhaps what we could be involved with is seeing how we could get the ability for for housing developers who develop affordable housing to have access to that land if they can build these units at a very, very affordable price? Would that help?
Yes.
And
Yes.
do we believe that there are other laws and policies that could be made by the people who have land use authority, whether it is what I just alluded to, the use of city-owned property or removing of obstacles in the city in order to expedite housing development for low-income developers? You think that it can be a better job done?
Absolutely.
Zoning and permitting issues also similarly could be reduced that would result in a lot more housing.
And
Federal property too. I would put federal property on that list as well.
Federal property too. How many people believe that we have systems that deal with the mentally ill and the developmentally disabled now that is working inside the processes for dealing with homelessness? What do? Do we have processes? None.
No.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I think that we've got to not only be concerned about the money, we're concerned about the money, and we should be, but we've got to look at these processes now. I'm not happy in Greater Los Angeles about the process. We just got a report that $3 million was returned that was unspent. We also know that in addition to unspent funds, I talked with my housing, public housing, about the CARES Act. They have not been able to get their money out. We've got to look at these processes. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The chair now recognizes Mr. Posey of Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver. Ms. McDonald,
Yeah.
clearly homelessness in a rich nation like ours is sad. It's a disappointing reality. Some critics suggest that we focus on housing the homeless, but they neglect, as you mentioned, an effective approach for dealing with the health and addiction issues that explain much of our homelessness. Tell us what you think the strategy should look like.
We developed a 3-legged stool. That was always our concept. In knowing the people and their needs, we concentrate on work, services, including working with people on their drug addictions, which 95% of our people have had, and job training, and increasingly we do training and entry to higher level secure jobs like union jobs. For the first time in America, because so many people in the construction industry are retiring or have retired, they have a huge shortage. We have worked some deals with unions to train people and license them. Training for these jobs for people not associated and part of a program like ours or anyone can't afford that training. It's very expensive. So homeless people could never afford it. Even poor people can't afford it. It's like saying, oh, pay for college. Okay. And we all want people to go to college, of course, and enter secure jobs. They have a right to support their families and get pensions and health care, of course. And I think to an earlier question, having the number of people that we've had on the streets of New York for all of these years, cleaning and serving the communities, has truly changed the perception of who, honestly, overwhelmingly minority people and formerly homeless and incarcerated people can achieve. We're all different, and homeless people are different. They are not a monolith. And as I said before, people with disabilities definitely need permanent housing. Is housing too expensive now for even working people? Of course. But breaking the cycle, life breaking the cycle, is an incredibly important part of this. And I gotta say, it totally, in a great part, it is due to prejudice, history of long racial inequity. Almost all the people that we serve are minority people. And so I believe still people feel, they're not so smart. I've known thousands personally. It's not true. They're like everybody else, just have lacked opportunity. And that's what I believe in. And what I've seen demonstrated that works. And the most important thing is, like HUD did previously, I think funding data-heavy social programs in transitional housing is critical for a large segment of the homeless population. Thank you.
Clearly, we need to move beyond housing only to deal effectively with the reasons people end up homeless on our streets. I can imagine that it can be hard to get the chronically homeless to enter treatment coaching programs. That might be even more difficult since Martin versus Boise case that held that people experiencing homelessness can't be arrested for sleeping outside of public property if there are no available alternatives. No one wants to criminally punish the homeless, but do local governments have the legal tools to get the homeless people into treatment and coaching programs? This is a question. Sorry, my time's up.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. The chair now recognizes Ms. Velasquez of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing. Ms. McDonald, New York City's LGBTQ senior population struggles with substandard housing conditions, poverty, and homelessness, particularly in parts of the Lower East Side in Manhattan that I represent. In fact, according to a study, nearly 1 in 4 of New York City's LGBTQ senior population was reported living in substandard housing. Can you speak to the unique challenges our LGBTQ seniors face, not only in New York, but across the country? And also, what recommendations do you have for addressing these challenges?
Yes.
Thank you.
As
I apologize, Ms. McDonald,
Oh,
this question
of
was directed
course.
to me. I appreciate the question, particularly as a queer non-binary person, and I have had the opportunity to do quite a bit of work actually with trans-identifying folks experiencing homelessness in New York City. The thing that folks need, and I think this is a thread today, is community, right? So one of the things that LGBTQ folks lift up quite frequently is, because they have navigated the world via chosen family networks, that like being able to engage in the chosen family networks inside the housing options that they have is really important. And so when we think about that, right, like we need to be prioritizing that kind of, or when we think about housing options, we need to be prioritizing those community engagements. We also need to be really clear-eyed, right, that particularly for our trans community, right, like there is still quite a bit of housing discrimination. And so folks do need robust protections as they attempt to access certainly any market rate housing, but even inside the homelessness system itself, we continue to see that there's quite a bit of discrimination against folks. And then the other thing that I would say is that, again, speaking to that incorporation of lived experience and that community aspect, for folks who are experiencing homelessness at any age range who identify as LGBTQ, one of the things that's in the data quite clearly is that pathways inside are often framed inside connecting with someone who is like them, right? Who they relate to and understand and can understand the things that they are going through. I once worked on a project compiling, actually this was for LGBTQ young people, again, trans young people, but compiling a manual for outreach workers and case managers around transition supports for trans women, and it was incredibly detailed medical information, right? That is not part of what most people know. And finally, I would just say that like we have to be thinking about seniors broadly, and I think the rest of the panel can talk to that.
Well, thank you for your answer. Ms. Oliva, one of the central tenets of tackling our homelessness crisis is to stop it before it starts and keep people stably housed. There is no denying that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the threat of homelessness for millions of individuals and families. But President Biden and congressional Democrats have responded by allocating more than $46 billion for emergency rental assistance. Can you explain how the creation of this program has helped keep individuals and families housed during the pandemic, particularly those on the lowest end of the spectrum?
Yes, I would be happy to do that, and thank you for the question. I think it's a really important question as we think about how we want to strengthen our affordable housing system to be better equipped for the next crisis or another crisis down the road. As I mentioned in my testimony, more than 3.2 million households have been served with the emergency rental assistance program between January and November of last year. And according to the Treasury's data, 88% of those who were served with that first tranche of ERA money were extremely low income or very low income, which means that that program is very well targeted to help the folks who need it the most. So folks who are in that, households who are in that program can receive rental and utility arrears to help them get caught up on rent, as well as prospective rent to help support stability through what are very difficult financial circumstances and help people get back on their feet. And it's largely credited with holding off a wave of potential evictions after the end of the federal eviction moratorium. So
Thank you for your answer.
Oh, sure. You're welcome.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. My time has almost expired. Thank you.
Ms. Oliva, did you finish your comment?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to just finish that thought. I think what I was trying to say at the end there was, as we know, as we've heard from Marc and Adrienne, homeless assistance systems are stretched to capacity right now, and a wave of evictions would have been disastrous for those systems, which is why we need more rental assistance resources in our communities, permanent rental assistance resources that can grow and contract based on needs. So the next time we have a crisis, we will be more prepared.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Rose of Tennessee, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, and thanks to Ranking Member Hill for holding this hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I was disappointed, however, to see the Democrats' tax and spend reconciliation bill attached to this hearing, a bill that has already passed the House without the support of a single Republican. And so that's disappointing to see. Now on to today's topics. A few months ago, I visited Independence Again in Cookeville, Tennessee, in my hometown and in the 6th District of Tennessee, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping individuals combat drug addiction. They are funded primarily through charitable donations with help from the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, in addition to payments that they receive from their residents. They also offer financial assistance to individuals when funds are available to assist those that cannot afford their program. Independence Again asks each resident to follow a set of rules to participate in the program. These include attending meetings, respecting curfews, and submitting to random drug screenings, all of which are aimed at providing structure and promoting individual responsibility. However, these common sense rules are disfavored under the Housing First approach. Ms. McDonald, your organization states that, quote, creating pathways to self-sufficiency and independence is at the heart of everything you do, close quote. Could you please speak more about the importance of ensuring that individuals leave programs with like this with the ability to maintain a stable job in addition to their sobriety?
Absolutely. Homeless people have problems. You couldn't live on the street without having trauma. And they, as I said, they need a three-legged stool approach. The reason the paid work that we offer at $15 an hour is so effective is because amongst the poorest people, money, of course, is essential. So we do not put people out on the street to clean or into buildings, and if they're using that, because it's not good for the community. So it does mean drug testing. It does mean very intense case management and drug services. The other thing I want to say is 70% of our staff are graduates.
Wow.
And I think that that has been key to our success. The other men, because they're staff, obviously see them as role models and see they gives them hope. Hope is very important. If you want people to give up drugs, if you want people to go to work, they need to have hope that they will achieve that. And there's no one that knows better. I learned everything I know from the homeless people we serve. They're the experts, and the homeless people on our staff, formerly homeless people. Do we have rules? Yes. Do you need to be drug tested? Yes. Violence, we have a security team, mostly of graduates. They don't permit violence. We have metal detectors because we have to protect the whole, and we don't allow guns. So yes, there are requirements for doing this. We don't throw anyone out on the street, though. You don't get paid for work. If it's a serious criminal thing, we call the police like anybody else, because you have to protect all of the other people that live there. So yes, we have rules. You have to and people want to pay child support.
Thank you, Ms. McDonald. I see my time has expired, and Chairman Cleaver, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Beatty of Ohio, not Cincinnati.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman of the Chiefs, and I'm proud to be of the Bengals. But with that said, and to our ranking member, thank you so much for holding this committee meeting today. And also thank you to all of our distinguished witnesses for being here today. Certainly, we know our chairman has spent a lifetime fighting and being an advocate for those in need of housing, just as you as witnesses have made a commitment to that. With that said, let's talk about the American Rescue Plan that Democrats passed earlier this year, and it was signed into law by President Biden. And I'm just so proud that I could be a part of that because it funded approximately 70,000 emergency housing vouchers for persons at risk of homelessness or survivors of domestic violence or human trafficking, something I've also spent a lot of time with prior to coming to Congress and now in Congress. I guess I want to start with you, Ms. Roman, Nan Roman. Can you tell me what kind of impact is this going to have on the homeless data that we've been able to do this?
Right. Well, so, you know, there are about 580,000 people homeless on any given night. This would be 70,000 vouchers. So it would certainly not solve the problem, but it would have an impact on it and really turn the corner. I will say, you know, the vouchers, however, are not going to only go to people who are literally homeless. There are other categories of people that are also eligible. And as I mentioned in my testimony, the fact that the systems are so beleaguered and overrun at the moment makes it more attractive to house sometimes people with fewer problems rather than people with more serious problems. And housing people with more serious problems, though, has the benefit of clearing them out of the shelter system so that we can reduce homelessness overall. So there are a lot of challenges going on, also partnering with healthcare and behavioral healthcare systems so that people do get the services and so forth they need in the housing is a challenge.
Thank you for mentioning that it goes to other things. In the session before, I think it was, I worked with Congressman Steve Stivers, and we did a bipartisan effort to make sure that Congress appropriated $20 million for family unification vouchers. And that was the first time that this program had been funded since 2010. And each year it has continued to be funded. Is this helpful? Would it be impact for that population that, as most of you know, is for those who are aged out of foster youth and family at risk being split up due to a lack of housing? What kind of impact is it having on that? And the reason I'm asking you as an expert to respond to this, because we have so many people, whether it was Build Back Better or the Rescue Plan, that didn't vote to support this. And then we want to always be like, we're so protective of our children or anti-human trafficking. So help me and others understand that when they cast that vote, it is so important for those watching to know when you look at us and the responsibility that we have to this population.
Sure. Too quickly, I'll just say a lot of people who have behavioral health issues, mental health and substance abuse issues, and who are homeless have those issues because of being homeless. They weren't the issues that caused their homelessness. They're causing those issues. So it really is important to have these resources. And another thing I'll say is we've been talking about the fact that all these resources are going in, but the homeless numbers are not going down. The reason the homeless numbers are not going down is something that's totally outside the ability of the homeless system to control, which is the people coming in. More people are coming in, and one of the systems that's sending people into homelessness is foster care. So the vouchers that you provided are really important. They're a hugely effective prevention mechanism to stop people from exiting foster care and sadly becoming homeless.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses.
Thank you, Ms. Beatty. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stile of Wisconsin. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding today's committee hearing. Ms. McDonald, I want to build on what my colleagues have been discussing today, in particular as it relates to Housing First. As you know, and I think as we're all really well aware, there's been a big shift at HUD and among practitioners to Housing First. And my concern is that the shift is really ignoring the fact that many homeless individuals need more than just a home. They need support to overcome, maybe it's addiction, maybe mental health, other challenges. It really reminds me, I went to a homeless shelter in Kenosha, Wisconsin called the Shalom Center. It provides a lot of those key wraparound services. I remember the tour was actually walking in a local church group, was preparing dinner that evening. It was a little before 5 o'clock, and I met a young man and came out and said hello and asked him if he was going to have dinner. He said, well, he was going to have breakfast. He just woke up. And I was kind of shocked. I was thinking, well, geez, it's almost 5 o'clock. And I asked him why. He said, well, he was going to work the night shift at the Amazon facility just down the road, which pays, well north of $15 an hour, often $18 to $20 an hour, depending on your exact shift. And the Shalom Center had provided some assistance. This young man fell on hard times through probably no fault of his own, and didn't have a family support structure where he could go, and he found himself in the receiving the hug of the Shalom Center. And they not only provided him the shelter, but they also provided him the connection into a local job to make sure that he could, get back up on his feet, not only to stabilize what was going on in his life, but also really to provide that next step so he could get out on his own into an apartment, and then maybe ultimately, hopefully someday, be able to own a home and move along in his progress in his life. And so here's my concern with the Housing First policy is sometimes it's missing some of the other key components of homelessness. And so could you comment, just in your experience, to what extent do non-housing related factors, so think about addiction or mental health challenges, how often is that contributing to homelessness? And then, assuming that's a big factor, can we really address some of the key challenges of homelessness without these key wraparound services?
I think that what is available today through permanent housing is certainly essential and designed and funded to serve people who are chronically mentally ill, suffer from other disabilities, and some moms with very young kids. And that's important. As I said, we have 14 buildings. But that is not the majority of the people who live on our streets. They have systemic, lifelong problems due to terrible education. Yes, totally foster care. We have tons of young people that come out of foster care. And incarceration. We can't lose sight of that piece. When you come out of prison, how are you going to get a job? Where are you going to live? And that's a very substantial part of the population we serve. Yes,
So if I can, I just want to continue this dialogue. And so totally agree. And so I look at some of your, the work that you've done with the Doe Fund. And then the question starts to become, right, is how has the Housing First policies impacted the Doe Fund?
Yes. When this policy was really first embraced in 2016, we lost all of our HUD money because we were not a permanent housing solution, but one that transitioned people to independence. And you need both. And to say that, well, these people can't live in this housing, the permanent housing, and there's no way to out of homelessness with a residential base. That's critical to us.
So we have limited time, unfortunately. So would you
Yes.
say that the housing first policies has negatively harmed vulnerable populations that you work with?
Yes, because they don't qualify.
I appreciate. I'm only cutting us off because of cognizant of the time. I appreciate your testimony, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding the hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes. You need to unmute.
Is that better, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. And this hearing is exceedingly important because, like you, I have persons who are living under an overpass near my office, and it's heartbreaking to see young people there, to see persons who appear to be associated with the military in one way or another, or at least they were veterans or they claim to be. But my question has more to do with how we approach the problem. There is a debate that looms that deals with whether we should have the services and resources centralized for persons who experience homelessness, or whether they should be decentralized. Whether we should take a holistic approach and have all of the resources in one area, or decentralize them and have them all over a given city, as well as the housing integrated into communities. And I bring this up because I think that the intentionality, to a certain extent, as it's been explained to me with reference to Skid Row, the intentionality was to do good, to help people, but then you have a concentration of people and services. On the other hand, there are many people who need the services, but they can't get to them because they don't have transportation. So if you decentralize, then transportation becomes a real issue for people who are homeless. So the question that I have is for persons who can help me with the question of centralized or decentralized, or maybe some other model. So Mr. Doanes, sir, would you care to respond, please?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think it's important that we create avenues for folks to get as much as they can in one-stop shops. I think that doesn't have to be, Skid Row. I think there are a lot of ways to do that. I think of Central City Concern, for example, in Portland, Oregon, which leverages a federally qualified health center to create an integrated model of housing and healthcare where all the supports are on site. And I think it's very possible to do in a way that doesn't create the sort of troubling trends of the concentration of suffering or poverty that we've seen in other jurisdictions. And I do briefly, I apologize, I do have to respond to some of the lines of questioning about housing first, which seem to confuse what housing first is.
Well, could you do this for me?
Really clear, housing first is not housing only. There have always been services involved. And we just have to have that as like what is true in this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Doanes. Ms. Olivia, I'd like for you to respond to the question that I posed. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, sir. I agree with Mark in that there are a number of ways that we can be providing both housing and services to people who are experiencing homelessness. And I would say a couple of things about that. Whether it's centralized or not centralized, I think it's important to ask people who are experiencing homelessness how they would like to receive and what kinds of services they would like to receive. And really providing choice for folks to access the kinds of housing supports and service supports that they want and need. And I also just have to make sure that we are correcting the record on Housing First. Housing First is not a program, it is an approach, and it actually provides folks with choice about what they want and need. It is not a one-size-fits-all, and it is not housing only. Those are really important pieces of this discussion that I think have been mischaracterized in this hearing.
All right. Well, thank you for your comments on Housing First as well, Mr. Doanes. I thank you too. So let's move now, if we may, to Ms. McDonald. Ms. McDonald, you have indicated, or it has been indicated, that there are drug tests that are required. Can you give me an indication as to what are the consequences if you fail the drug test, please?
Yes, and thank you. It's really not having people go out to work, because number one, they work in communities all over New York City, and you can't be high. Second of all, maybe the most successful part of it is that people want to make money, and that's what they lose. All of the people want to have their own housing. They want to get back with their children. They want to be functioning members, but they can't do that if they're continuing to get high.
My time has expired. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Green. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Hill. I think this is an important hearing. I appreciate the witnesses being here. Remember Ronald Reagan's time-hallowed comment that the best social program in the world is a job, and so employment is really a key feature to helping people not need whatever the social program that we're discussing is. And here we're talking about homelessness, which is a very very serious and something that we continue to try to address in our society. We've seen different places have different levels of success. It certainly seems that I hear a consensus among witnesses that the wraparound services addressing drug addiction, addressing mental health, as well as housing and employment, and trying to help a person sort of get back on their feet. And once they're fully employed, they can be a contributing member of society. And I think that is probably ultimately all of our objectives, that what we're trying to see. One thing I will express concern about, and I think it's germane, particularly in this committee, is that I believe that one of the big drivers of inflation last year was the rise in rent, and making housing more expensive as a result of the excessive printing of money by the Federal Reserve that was driven by the deficit spending that was so profligate over the last 2 years, particularly the last year. And so I'm worried that we're going to see another wave of homelessness. I think I'm concurring with some of our witnesses here as a result of the inflation that is driven. So it's interesting. We're borrowing money, creating inflation, trying to put it into homelessness, which will actually create more homelessness. So I'm not sure that is the correct way to address this problem. Ms. McDonald, I just wanted to. You were in the middle of saying something about your work in New York City, and I want to just commend you for your work and success. Clearly, you've had a lot of success, and it seems like but one of your focuses is not just housing, but also the wraparound services. And I think you were in the middle of saying something when you were cut off.
I was going to say that's why we start, in order to be successful in our people earning money while they're with us, so that makes them able to save money and contribute to child support.
Sure. Well, I think, could you just build on
job is for the vast majority of people, a job is essential to independence. It is independent.
Sure. And so, focusing on jobs, economic growth is the key. Texas has been an enormously successful state in its job creation, and actually, from an employment point of view, has completely recovered from the pandemic. While other states, which have, and again, these are choices that different local leaders have made, but shutting down harder during the pandemic has hurt a lot of businesses, and they're having a harder time recovering from an employment point of view, and that exacerbates that homelessness, right? I mean, like if there's joblessness and homelessness are kind of almost seem to go hand in hand. Would you agree with Ms. McDonald?
Absolutely. I was actually going to tell you about a participant, a current participant. He came to, we got a big contract with what's called the Cleanup Corps, New York City's Cleanup Corps, to clean the streets in a much broader areas and in poor neighborhoods because of the pandemic. This young man entered that way, through that recruitment process. At that time, he lived with his brother. He had a long, long history of substance abuse, lack of education and training. And when his brother moved out of state, he called us because he was homeless and we already employed him. And the result, as it is in so many cases, has been that he was on a local TV show talking about the cleanup course. In the same week, he got to see his daughter, who he had been estranged with previously for many years. And he went to her 9th birthday party. He had seen her before that. And she told him he was her hero.
Oh.
And I hear children saying that frequently.
Wow. Well, Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Vargas of California. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I say anything else, Ms. McDonald, thank you. God bless you. I have to tell you, I can't tell you how much I've appreciated your testimony today, honestly. You know, it reminds me of Jesus's admonition in John 15 that you love one another as I have loved you, or Matthew 19, you love your brother as yourself. And I never met your husband, but I assume that he probably had that in mind too. And I have to tell you, I assume you're a Republican because all the Republicans are asking you questions. And I have to say that normally when we talk about homeless or people who are incarcerated or undocumented people, I don't always hear my brothers and sisters on the other side talking to them as they were humans or our brothers and sisters. Sometimes, especially with undocumented people, the conversation goes so sideways. Just listening to you is so uplifting. So God bless you. And I mean that. God bless you.
Thank you.
And again, all your work that you've done, I'm just so pleased with that. But anyway, putting that aside for a second, I have to say that we've talked about this a little bit. You know, it's the price of housing that has gone up so dramatically, that has caused so many people to be homeless. I remember when I bought my house that I still live in 1993, we paid $176,000 for it. That's what we paid. Today, if you put it in an inflation calculator, it's about $330,000. My neighbor just sold his house and he bought it about the same time I did. He sold it for $1.6 million. How can you afford that? I mean, it's ridiculous. And that's why we get so many homeless too, the price of housing in California, because everyone wants to move. People say they're all moving away. Well, I got to tell you, every time someone puts a house up, they sell in about a week. It's because people love to live there. We need more housing. So I appreciate that. I do want to ask one particular question. My good friend and colleague, Salud Carbajal, asked me to ask about the Naomi Schwartz Safe Parking Act, where he has proposed that so many people now live in their cars too, that they have this grant where the cities and localities can help people transition from the cars, but at least have a safe place for a while. I understand that Ms. Roman, you know a little bit about this. May I question you on that real quickly?
Sure.
So what do you think about it?
Well, I think I'll tell you the truth. A while ago, I would have said I didn't think it was such a great idea, but I've really been changing my mind about it. There are a lot of people who their only asset is their vehicle. If they were going to stay in a shelter, they would probably lose their vehicle because there's no place for them to park, especially in California. and in the West, if they are going to get to jobs, which is, we've said repeatedly, I think the witnesses have said 40% of people who are homeless are working. Most people who are homeless get out of homelessness by working. The average length of time people are homeless is 6 weeks. So a car, a vehicle is really important. It's an asset. If they can't park it legally someplace, they get ticketed. If they can't pay the tickets, they may get cited or incarcerated because of that. It allows them to get their kids to school, to get themselves to work.
So you think it's a good idea? It's a good model. Okay, I do too. I mean, this is such a complicated issue. Ms. McDonald, going to you, even though I'm a Democrat, I almost feel like I owe you this time. Obviously, you're dealing with really hardcore issues, it sounds like. How about families? Do you guys deal with any families?
We started much more recently in our permanent housing. And it's a different animal. They need the same help, but they have very young children. And those children need that person at home. And so they can't go to work in the beginning for sure. And there's no daycare. And I just want to tell you, I'm not a Republican. I don't, say I'm a Republican or a Democrat. But I'm not a Republican at all. So, and I'm not a Democrat.
I'll tell you a little secret. I like Republicans. Sometimes
well, me too. French Hill is my friend.
He's mine too.
And I know a lot of other amazing Republican leaders. I mean, Arthur Brooks, do you know Arthur? He used to be head of the American Enterprise Institute. He's been so helpful to me and has been one of our great champions. He's a Republican. So, yeah, and we've had huge fans that are Democrats.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Thank you, Evangelist Vargas. Appreciate your comments as well. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for including in this hearing my Homelessness Assistance Act, which is designed to allow public housing authorities to share data with local government agencies, with nonprofit organizations engaged in the continuum of care. And according to research done by the Pew Charitable Trust, this sort of data sharing paved the way for the state of Virginia to become the first state to, in their words, functionally end veteran homelessness. We passed this bill in 2020 through the full House, and I look forward to getting the support of our colleagues and passing it to again, and hopefully the Senate will take it up. I think a lot of people have made the point that housing is too expensive. Rent is too high. And it's a matter of supply and demand. Rent isn't expensive everywhere, but it is expensive in my district and Juan Vargas's district and many of the other districts represented here. I turn to colleagues in other parts of the country where you can build an apartment for $100,000. My city's trying to build just a shelter for homeless people and is spending $500,000 or $600,000 to do so. We've got to bring down the cost of construction, and that means allowing people to build, which gets very controversial on the local level. Ms. Olivia, given the complex nature of housing policies, We've got to look for ways to increase the supply of affordable housing and provide those families and individuals in need with assistance. Do you believe that the passage of the Stable Families Act proposed by our colleague, Mr. Torres from New York, would help prevent families who fall on hard times from experiencing homelessness? And of course, this is a bill that provides $3 billion in short-term rental assistance to targeted low-income people who are living paycheck to paycheck and are at risk of being evicted. Ms. Olivia?
Great. Thank you so much for that question, sir. Rental assistance is a key component of our strategies that we need to have in place in order to address the homelessness and housing affordability crisis. So really what we've been talking about and what is included in Build Back Better, as well as partially included in the bill that you're talking about, is a three-pronged approach. Making sure that we are keeping the units that are affordable in our communities in place by creating funds to address the backlog of needs in public housing, increasing the supply where we need it in this country for affordable housing. But I think one of the most important pieces, as you pointed out, is really about increasing affordability through an expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. That will allow units that are created with those supply dollars to actually be affordable to folks who are at the lowest incomes, including incomes from 0 to 30% or 50% of the area median income. And right now in Build Back Better, the version that passed the House, it includes an increase in the Housing Choice Voucher Program that would serve about 300,000 households after it is phased in, including 80,000 households experiencing homelessness, 700,000 people in total, including.
Let me squeeze in one more question for you. We need to build 328,000 new apartments every year. I think we need 328,000 just in the LA area. What policies do you advocate in order to create additional apartment units?
Yeah, so what we really are focused on is ensuring that we have affordable housing that is affordable to folks who are at the lowest incomes. Mm-hmm. And so the most targeted program to do that is the National Housing Trust Fund.
I don't know if I can squeeze in one more question. Ms. Bush, well, we've got Section 8, 2.1 million households are assisted in their rent. Perhaps for the record, you can tell us what we can learn from the private sector to make the Section 8 program more effective.
Yeah, very quickly.
Thank you for the question. I think we always need to concentrate our thoughts on deep affordability, what is affordable to extremely low income constituents, and build with that in mind, and leverage both the power of the government but also the private sector to make sure we're addressing those needs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lawson of Florida. Mr. Lawson, we're pleased to see that you're continuing to recover. Glad to have you here at the hearing today. You now have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the great job that you're doing with this committee. Homelessness is a big issue in my district, especially in Duval and in Jacksonville area, and here in Tallahassee. My question is to the whole panel, and anyone on the panel can respond to it. You know, a November 2021 report from the Florida Council on Homelessness said it is too early to know the effects of COVID on homelessness, but some reports show crowded facilities with many being turned away due to lack of supplies and staff. Facilities all over the country report high rates of burnout among staff, particularly due to rapid turnover and short staffing. How might Congress, and I don't know whether we can do it, but better assist these shelters to ensure facilities are receiving enough supplies and providing staff with additional support in order to continue to help people in need. And anyone on the panel can address it.
I'd be happy to go first, Representative. You know, in our jurisdiction, quite frankly, we need funding in order to pay people more. Like, as I mentioned in my opening testimony, folks are making poverty wages trying to end homelessness, and the burnout rates are expansive, and folks are simply leaving. And we need to be able to continue. At the local level, we've cobbled together money to do emergency funding, like hazard pay kinds of things. We need money to continue to do that. That would be the most helpful thing that our jurisdiction could receive from the federal government right now.
Anyone else want to respond?
I would be happy to go next.
Okay, Ms. McDonald.
Oh no, that's Ms. Oliva.
Okay, sorry.
Just wanted to make sure that was clear for the record.
Okay.
So, you know, I agree with Marc completely that we have to invest in our workforce in order to make sure that that workforce is stable and well trained and sort of not also dealing with housing instability while they're trying to solve the housing instability for people that they're serving. I talked to a person who was experiencing homelessness who told me that they had cycled through 10 case managers in their time at a particular program. And that's not good for the case managers, but it's also really not good for them to build their own rapport with somebody and really get the services that they need. That said, the answer to homelessness and to addressing the needs that are in shelters is permanent housing, affordable, safe, permanent housing in jurisdictions across the country. And that means that we need to increase the supply of affordable housing and the affordability across the country with the investments that I talked about earlier in the National Housing Trust Fund and an expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. That will make everybody's job easier and it will serve people in the way that they've asked to be served.
Okay, I'm gonna try to get in this next question. This is very important to the panel. Making more vouchers available would mean that fewer people would live in shelters or motels or on the streets or in overcrowded homes. Do you agree with the statement? And if more vouchers was widely available, how do we suggest we quickly get individual families in shelters approved to get them into homes?
Well, I can start on that one. Definitely more vouchers are what are needed. And I think we need to also use those vouchers strategically for the people with the highest needs. What would help them get into housing quickly is if PHAs have flexibility or exercise the flexibility to reduce some of their requirements in terms of documentation and so forth. If we also had a more organized sector that was doing landlord coordination, landlord cultivation to find units. And also we need to pay the homelessness sector to do navigation to help people who are homeless find units. It's not really practical for someone who's living in a shelter to be going all around town talking to landlords trying to find a unit. So we need to build up more infrastructure there. That's happening, but it could be happening faster.
Okay, I have some other questions, but I yield back and I'll probably send those in. But I just want to say this, Mr. Chairman, before you cut me off, is we've been talking about this homeless crisis for the last 4 years. And we have the ability in Congress to do something about it. And all of us should be, with COVID and everything else, is that we allocate money for everything else, but we really should take people off the streets, you know, and give them a safe environment, a place to live, you know, to put a roof over their head. This winter is going on and everything else, but we are not doing it. We are debating what vouchers is all about instead of putting money where it should be. And so I admire, Mr. Chairman, the work the chairwoman wanting to do something about it because it keeps escalating. And with that, I yield back.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lawson. That's why we're doing Build Back Better. Ms. Axley of Iowa, the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. This is such a critical subject for this committee to be working on. And unfortunately, as we've heard, not as much progress that we'd like to be seeing here. After numbers were dropping from 2007 to 2016, we've now seen increases in the number of people experiencing homelessness for each of the last 4 years. And sadly, right here in Iowa, that includes an increase of 14% just in this last year, which is unfortunately the third largest increase in the country. But one of the things that really jumped out at me is the large increase in the number of unsheltered people, which is up more than 25% in the last 4 years. And that's especially true in our rural areas where 44% of people experiencing homelessness were unsheltered. So I've been working specifically on that issue since I think we all recognize that sometimes what works in cities might not work in rural areas in the same way. So I'd like to start by asking you, Ms. Roman, can you describe some of the specific challenges of working on rural homelessness?
Sure. Well, a big challenge is that there's just not the homelessness infrastructure in rural areas because the numbers don't, because there are not as many people who need it. So they don't, numbers wise, not percentage wise. So there's not necessarily an entire homelessness infrastructure of shelter and services and so forth in every community. And because of that, people also double up. So it's not necessarily as obvious that they're homeless or that they're having housing problems. So I think that probably what's needed is more direct assistance to households just to get rehoused, and a lot of the kind of intermediate things that we have in the bigger cities could be avoided and just help people get into housing more quickly.
Thank you for that. And I have a bill we're considering at this hearing to work on those exact issues and to expand the uses of homelessness funding for rural areas. I think you've seen the bill. Do you think that this would help get people sheltered in rural areas?
I do think it would help a lot. We've when the McKinney Act was reauthorized, we got something similar to this for rural areas, but it's never been implemented. It just because of financing reasons. But I do think that focusing on relocation assistance, on short-term lodgings, on repairs and things like that would work very well in rural areas and help us decrease the numbers there.
Thank you. And are there any additional flexibilities that you'd recommend to this legislation?
I don't have anything right now, but we can look at it and get back to you about that.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. Moving on, Ms. Oliva, I know you've done a lot of work in this area as well. Do you have any thoughts on this bill? And do you have you brought up a few things, and I heard your resources on needing more people to help out. Many of you have mentioned that, but do you have any thoughts on this bill and any additional uses for the fundings that you would suggest?
Thank you for the question. I believe in my last year in service at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we were proposing something similar to what your bill reflects, which is to make the continuum of care program a little bit more flexible for those rural areas, especially since we don't have a program that is specifically designed for rural areas. So I think the bill makes a lot of sense. I've actually talked to the folks at the Housing Assistance Council about their thoughts on the bill as well. And those flexibilities are going to be really important. Things like bringing housing up to code. Those are the kinds of things that our rural communities have been asking for.
Thank you. Well, I'll tell you what, my goal is to make some simple changes just to make sure that we are helping these rural areas with homelessness. And to your point, it is a different approach that's needed in our bigger areas. We don't have connectivity necessarily, for the homelessness in the way that we do in some of our larger urban areas. So I'm hoping that we can get this bill through so we can address those different solutions, as you've all talked about here, and put those into practice very quickly. This idea actually originally came from HUD under the last administration, and I'm hoping we can recognize this as the common sense solution, I should say, that it is. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and thank you for asking my questions. I yield back.
Yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Torres of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The solution to homelessness
Hello?
Mr. Chair, do you hear me?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
The solution to homelessness is affordable housing. You know, if we did not have zoning laws that made it illegal to build affordable housing, we would have more affordable housing and less homelessness. If we had more federal funding for creating and preserving affordable housing, we would have more affordable housing and less homelessness. In the end, homelessness is a public policy choice. I have a few thoughts to offer on street homelessness in particular. You know, for me, there's something profoundly dehumanizing about the American discourse surrounding street homelessness. We often speak as if those living on the street are quality of life conditions to be cleaned up or sanitary conditions to be swept away. We often speak of the street homeless as nuisances to be cycled in and out of the criminal justice system. And most people pass by the street homeless every day without even the barest acknowledgement of their basic humanity. For me, the street homeless should be seen not as threats to our quality of life, but as people in need of housing and services. The homeless should be seen not as an aesthetic blight on our society, but our society should be seen as a moral blight on the homeless who have been left to languish on the streets, unhoused and uncared for. Even though most homelessness is essentially a consequence of the affordability crisis, I do believe there is a mental health dimension to chronic street homelessness. And for me, the intersection of housing and healthcare underscores the urgent need to invest in supportive housing, which is housing with services. So my first question is to Ms. Roman. Is it fair to say that supportive housing is not only the most humane, but also the most cost-effective approach to addressing the most chronic forms of street homelessness?
Definitely housing with services, permanent supportive housing has proven effective over the years in reducing chronic homelessness quite substantially and would do the same for unsheltered chronic homelessness. Yes.
And it's more cost effective than psychiatric hospitalization, correct?
There's a lot of data that indicates that for people with behavioral health disorders, that housing and services is less expensive than leaving them on the street or in shelter and overusing emergency assistance.
Right, so it's more cost effective than psychiatric hospitalization, than the shelter system, than the criminal justice system. And yet there are more people in America who get mental health care from jails rather than from supportive housing developments. Indeed, one of the largest providers of mental health in the United States is Rikers Island, the New York City jail system. In FY 2020, it cost New York City nearly $500,000 to incarcerate an individual on Rikers Island. In FY 2017, it cost New York City $73,000 to provide emergency shelter to a family and $38,000 to provide emergency shelter to an adult. And so even if you have no compassion for the poor, even if you have no core belief in housing as a human right, the fact remains that permanent housing for those in need is far less expensive than incarceration or temporary shelter. Ms. Roman, do you share that assessment?
I do share that assessment. Yes, that's what the data indicates.
And the Ending Homelessness Act, which codifies housing vouchers for all, would radically reduce homelessness in America. I know of no other policy that would create so much affordability for so many so quickly. If the United States were to implement housing vouchers for all, hundreds of thousands of units, maybe even millions of units, would become affordable to families almost overnight. Does anyone have any thoughts on the importance of housing vouchers for all?
Well, they would certainly that's the case. There's a supply issue. Having housing vouchers would generate some supply, but there would need to be subsidy for other supply. But it would definitely, that's the solution. I will also just say briefly that when I started working on housing issues, which was in the late 70s, we had poverty, we had mental illness untreated, we had substance abuse disorders. We did not have homelessness. And that's because there was an adequate supply of affordable housing at the time.
And if I may, I would just add to everything that Nan just said, which I agree with, that if we were to go to the universal housing voucher model, we would be lifting 9.3 million people above the poverty line, and people of color would benefit from that. quite a bit. So I think it's incredibly important to be thinking about this in the way you just laid it out, Representative Torres.
We have the power to create affordable housing on a mass scale instantaneously. What we're lacking is the political will. So I'll leave it at that.
Is that, I mean, did you get a full opportunity to raise your question, Mr. Torres? I didn't know if you cut off.
I did. If I don't know if I can make one more point, I don't want to.
Please, I'm going to allow Republicans, Democrats, Cincinnati Bengals, anybody to, have the make sure you get your final thought out.
So there's a local example in New York City that illustrates the power of housing vouchers. New York City recently passed a law that raised the value of city vouchers to the same standard as Section 8. And before the law passed, there were only 564 units affordable to those with a city voucher. After the law passed, there were 72,000 units affordable to those with a city voucher tied to Section 8. So that is one example of the sheer power of a housing voucher program to create mass affordability and to do so instantaneously. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Now recognizes the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver. Thank you for witnesses being here today. The pandemic has drawn new attention to the eviction crisis and how it contributes to homelessness, racial and gender devastating, disruptive, and violent events that not only destabilize families in the short term, but also make them, yes?
No, we're getting some interference. The staff is probably trying to get it straight now. So I apologize. We're
Very good. May I have my time back, Mr. Chair, whenever it's good to go?
Absolutely. Okay, are we good, Franklin? Okay. Proceed, Ms. Presley. Sorry, I apologize.
No problem. Take two. Again, thank you, Chairman Cleaver, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The pandemic has drawn new attention to the eviction crisis and how it contributes to homelessness, racial and gender. And evictions are devastating, disruptive, and violent events that not only destabilize families in the short term, but also make it more expensive and challenging to rent safe housing in the future, apply for credit, borrow money, or to purchase a home. In Massachusetts, Black renters are 2.4 times more likely to have
We're having a problem again. I apologize, Mr. Presley. We're trying to get it straight here. I tell you what, why don't we proceed with the next and try to get Ms. Presley's audio straightened out, and it's actually visual as well now. And then we'll come back, Ms. Presley, to you so that you have your complete 5 minutes time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to recognize my fellow Kentuckian, Adriana Bush, who is testifying with us today. Adrienne, how are you? As Executive Director of the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky, Adrienne and her team have done some truly life-changing work in the Commonwealth. And while we may disagree on the merits of the federal government's exclusive reliance on the Housing First policy, I do want to thank her and her team for their advocacy on behalf of the over 4,000 street and sheltered homeless and disadvantaged Kentuckians. In the first 5 years after 2014, when the U.S. adopted Housing First as its exclusive solution to combating homelessness, unsheltered homeless increased more than 20%, despite substantial increases in federal funding. This increase came after a decade of decline in homelessness of roughly 31% between 2007 and 2014. In California, which doubled down on Housing First by requiring all state funding go to Housing First programs, the results are even more telling. Between 2015 and 2019, unsheltered homeless in California rose 47%. So in my view, the data is clear. Housing First has been a failure. Last year, I introduced the Housing Promotes Livelihood and Ultimate Success Act, or the Housing Plus Act, which would make more inclusive the allocation of grant money to combat homelessness. We tried an exclusive Housing First model and it did not work. Now we should expand the toolkit and bring more providers into the fold. Ms. McDonald, what impact would an approach like the one I've proposed have on combating homelessness, and will allocating federal funds to more rather than fewer qualified providers, including the DOE fund, help transition people out of homelessness? You need to turn on your volume there. Mr. Chairman?
Yeah,
Yes,
I think we're good.
Okay.
please. Go ahead, please.
Go ahead, Ms. McDonald.
Yes. As I said before, homelessness is not made up of a monolithic group of people. And I think it was a disservice to stop funding any transitional programs that provided housing, as well as, you know, more communal services. I think one of the great benefits to us and to the people we serve have been our ability to form strong communities of upwardly mobile people that get support from the staff that are vastly, the majority are formerly homeless folks. I think there have to be a multiple of answers to a very complex issue. We're fortunate because we're a social enterprise. So we get contracts for the work we do and a lot of donations because of our high visibility on the streets. But social enterprise can be a core piece of some homeless programs. We earn that the money that allows our guys to get paid at $15 an hour and save money and all of those things because we run businesses and they are competitive with for-profit businesses.
Ms. McDonald, my time is running out, so I'll reclaim my time, but I do appreciate the fact that the DOE Fund and similar organizations do provide that wraparound services. And, you know, we need to identify homelessness as not just a problem of lacking a roof over your head, but there's underlying causes for homelessness, whether it's mental health, lack of case management, lack of skills or financial literacy or what have you, substance abuse disorder. We need to meet these folks where they are. And I subscribe to my good friend Juan Vargas's citation to scripture that we need to really care for these people, not just warehouse them, but care for them. And that's why I oppose Housing First. And let me just briefly engage my constituent, Ms. Bush. Your testimony today strongly advocates for the use of Housing First. And of course, your coalition is based in my district. This issue was brought to my attention by another constituent organization in Franklin County. And when I was visiting that transitional housing facility that catered to women recovering from substance abuse disorders, what one of the ladies told me was, please, please, please beg me not to force her to live in a shelter where there are other active users. And the Housing First approach would have forced her to be surrounded by other people who are in active addiction and using drugs. And she thought that was going to, and you can understand, that was going to compromise her recovery. So I invite your feedback on that.
Sure. And thank you, Congressman. It is always good to see you, even over a camera on the computer. Janet Gates the director of the Franklin County Women and Family Shelter, is who I think you're referring to.
Yes,
And
yes.
he is a good friend of mine. We've known each other for a long time. And having done this work in a rural community, I spent 15 years of my life in Eastern Kentucky. I have worked the overnight shelter shift. I know that we have folks in varying stages of recovery, and that a lot of any sort of substance use issues may have come after becoming homeless. It is, you do want to be careful. I will say that Franklin County Women and Family Shelter seems to have pivoted because their mission really is tied to recovery. And so they are a recovery facility. And thanks to the Career Act and other, community development block grant funding, things that may be more appropriate to the recovery funding and, quite frankly, more generous than how the Emergency Solutions Grant program is funded, they may end up being in a better place. And I just want to say, I have worked in a transitional housing program that was continuum of care funded back in the 2000s. I have done transitional shelter. I became a housing first advocate because I saw that that is what works from my perspective. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to meet people where they are. One of the things I like about true high fidelity housing first programming is that it does meet people where they are and it prioritizes choice and opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. President, again, we apologize. I'm not sure what happened, but you are now recognized.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll try this again. So just getting to my first question here for Ms. Oliva, could you just speak to how the policy of reporting evictions on Consumer Reports, how that worsens the homelessness crisis and makes it harder really for people to find safe, affordable homes and to access the financial tools that they need to be successful?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. I think it's really an important question as we think about homelessness prevention and eviction prevention overall. We know that evictions perpetuate cycles of homelessness and housing instability, and that a lot of landlords use Consumer Reports during their initial tenant screening. And then they may choose to not rent to a tenant who has a history of eviction. That happens even when an eviction filing is ultimately withdrawn. Sometimes those withdrawn filings still show up on a tenant's consumer report without the additional context or ability for that tenant or prospective tenant to be able to explain what happened or what that particular context was. So, and then you also noted that this is a particular problem, especially for renters of color. And in particular, Black and Latina women are more likely to be evicted than their male counterparts, as well as the irritability filed against for eviction. So it really does have a huge impact to people not being able to exit homelessness.
Thank you. Well, I mean, it's clear that the U.S. credit system is one that perpetuates racism and economic justice, while its benefactors attempt to sort of pass it off as an objective metric of financial trustworthiness. In reality, this policy further entrenches injustice and acts as a barrier to families' ability to realize their basic human rights to housing and opportunity. And we know that prior to the pandemic, it was estimated that around 3.7 million evictions are filed every year. So that's at a rate of around 7 per minute. But even though this data is very jarring, it still may not show the full story of the eviction crisis. Ms. Oliva, do you mind just defining what are illegal evictions and how prevalent are they and how are they carried out?
Sure. So an illegal eviction is an eviction where a landlord doesn't follow state or local laws and includes a number of tactics like changing the locks, removing somebody's belonging from a unit without a court order. We've heard of people who actually remove the front door to units as a method of an illegal eviction or turning off the utilities. But I would also note that sometimes just the threat of an eviction from a landlord, for all the reasons that we just talked about the kind of impact an eviction can have on somebody's record, can actually incentivize a family to move out of a unit. So, you know, we don't always know, we don't know, these are illegal, so we don't know exactly how many obviously are happening. But what I would note is that a lot of times they happen because landlords have access to legal counsel. About 90% of landlords have access to legal counsel when they're filing an eviction, but only 10% of tenants have access to legal counsel when they're fighting an eviction.
Thank you for that. And so, Ms. Oliva, what if landlords were required to inform tenants of their rights? Would that help to crack down on these illegal evictions? Again, illegal and also incredibly demoralizing in so many ways, you know, given the imagery that you provided there about what often happens. But what if they were required, landlords, to inform tenants of their rights? Do you think that this would crack down these illegal evictions and reduce the numbers?
So I guess what I would say to that is that the more that tenants know about their rights, the better. And the better equipped they are to fight back against illegal or unjust practices. But they also need access to counsel and strong local and state tenant protections. And then at the end of the day, if we could make housing more affordable to more households through an expansion of the supply and an expansion of our affordability programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, all of that would lessen the burden on these tenants, especially extremely low income tenants and tenants of color.
Thank you. I'm almost out of time here. You know, I would add to that, you know, if they were required to provide justification for an eviction in writing, that might also combat. But that's why I've introduced the Housing Emergencies Lifeline Program Act, not only to prohibit the reporting of eviction data on consumer reports, but it funds legal counsel for those facing eviction and cracks down on illegal evictions in that exact way. So I hope my colleagues will support this legislation as a critical part of our larger, long overdue strategy to end homelessness. And I yield. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are you have any, you know, we messed you up. So if you have any comments, please.
I'm all set. Ms. Oliva answered my questions and also was able to speak about my legislative solutions and response. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today. And without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to email addresses provided to your offices. If there are no pertinent questions or comments, this hearing is now adjourned.